Hello. Today I'll attempt to introduce and discuss the text Hayy Ibn Yaqzan by the philosopher Ibn Tufayl. While researching the text and its author, I came across what I consider the perfect description of the text. Someone called it the influential text that no one ever heard of. I'm an Arab and a Muslimah, yet I did not actually engage with this text until a couple of years back, which is something that I'm not proud of. I believe I'm not unique in my ignorance of the text, even among the educated and the well-read individuals of the same background. This made me wonder, why is such an important text from my heritage remain obscure and is never taught, as far as I know, in our schools? I hope a discussion of the text and its ideas and influences might shed a light on how keeping the work obscure might have been deliberate and not just an unfortunate coincidence. Let's start. When we mention Hayy Ibn Yaqzan, we're actually talking about not one, but four different philosophical works by four philosophers from the Islamic world. Scholars usually divide those philosophers into two groups: East philosophers, the most influential of whom are Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, and the third is Ibn Sina, or as he is also known in the West, Avicenna. Ibn Sina might be better known for his revolutionary work in medicine, the Canon, but he was, as all scholars of his time, a polymath who also studied and excelled in philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, chemistry, theology, and many more. He also wrote the original text titled Hayy Ibn Yaqzan, which inspired the next three philosophers who followed him to write their own text with the same title. The second group of philosophers is of philosophers of the Islamic West, and the three most famous are Ibn Baga, Ibn Tufayl, and Ibn Rushd, also known as Averroes. The second text, titled Hayy Ibn Yaqzan, and the focus of this presentation was by Ibn Tufayl, who was born in Andalusia 70 years or so after the death of Ibn Sina. Ibn Tufayl introduces his text by mentioning how he read Ibn Sina's Hayy, and that, while he holds a lot of respect for Ibn Sina, he differs with him in some aspects, and thus he created his version of the text to express his own ideas in a more accessible way. Two more philosophers followed the same path of creating text influenced by Ibn Sina's original Hayy, and those are Al-Sahrawardi and Ibn Nafis. As I mentioned, the text we're going to discuss today is the one by Ibn Tufayl. And I'd like to call your attention to the title of the text, which is also the name of the main character. Hayy Ibn Yaqzan could be loosely translated to alive, son of alert. The name reflects the essential ingredients in our hero's character that allowed him to go through the development that he experienced. Also, for those who don't read Arabic, I highly recommend the shown translation by Len Goodman, which also includes an elaborate commentary on the text. Ibn Tufayl was born in Wadi Ash, province of Granada, Andalusia. In his youth, Al-Muravids dynasty was replaced by Al-Muhads, or Al-Muwahhidin as we know it in Arabic, a new Amazigh dynasty from North Africa. Ibn Tufayl was a polymath. He was a philosopher, physician, an Islamic theologian, an astronomer, and more. He worked as a wazir and a physician for Abu Ya'qub Yusuf, the Khalifa of Al-Muwahhidin. Ibn Tufayl nominated Ibn Rushd for the task of producing commentaries on Aristotle's work, as requested by Abu Ya'qub Yusuf. His most famous work is this philosophical novel, Hayy Ibn Yaqzan. The text. Ibn Tufayl's Hayy Ibn Yaqzan has two beginnings. First, he tells us that Hayy was created spontaneously when the conditions on his island swirled together to create a perfect moment. Now, for those uncomfortable with the idea of spontaneous creation, Ibn Tufayl gives us a second option. He says, on a neighboring island, there's a proud and possessive king who puts a lot of obstacles in the way of his sister's suitors. The sister falls in love with a relative called Yaqzan or Awake, and they secretly marry, and she bears him a son called Hayy. The sister is scared for her life and for her son's life, so she takes the baby, puts him in a basket in the sea, and the tide carries the basket to the nearby island. Now, regardless of which version we prefer, an infant, Hayy, is the only human on the island and is living at the mercy of nature around him. He is suckled and adopted by a gazelle that mistook him for her lost fawn. As an infant, Hayy becomes very attached and totally dependent on the doe. And the only language Hayy grew up to speak was the language of the animals and birds around him. Now, Ibn Tufayl tells us that Hayy went through 7 phases of development. Each phase is 7 years long. So the first phase was since his birth until he turned 7. The title of this phase could be frustration. Hayy observed the animals around him, and he quickly noticed that he's naked because he has no fur or feathers like the other animals. He's also weaponless because he lacks any of the natural weapons that the other animals have. He's also very slow compared to the speed of animals around him. And finally, he was totally dependent on his mother for nourishment, unlike other animals his age who were able to hunt for themselves. The second phase, we can call it the phase of action. So, despite realizing his physical weaknesses, Hayy also realized that he was superior rationally to other animals. He was able to use his rationale to solve most of the problems he had. So he used feathers to cover his body, and he used sticks and horns to defend himself. He also domesticated and rode horses and zebras to be able to run along other animals. And he also learned how to provide for himself and for his mother, who was growing old. The third phase, we can call it the phase of curiosity. The mother doe grew old and one day she dies. Hayy was overwhelmed with grief. He examined her but found no visible wounds or damage to her body. So he decides to look inside. He dissects her and examines her internal organs one by one until he finds her heart. He examines the chambers of the heart, then he concludes that something special used to occupy the heart, and now it has left his mother's body. That is, he realizes that what makes animals and himself alive is not just physical or mechanical. He sees a crow burying a dead one, and he does the same with his mother's decaying body. The third phase could be titled Wonder. Hayy discovers fire. He sticks his hand in it, gets burned, but he learns how to use it for warmth and to cook his food. He ponders the properties of different things around him. He notices that smoke and steam go up, water, ice fall down, and he starts to categorize things around him like rocks and air and fire and so on. He continues to dissect the bodies of dead animals to find the secret of life, and finally he arrives to the concept of the soul. Hayy notices similarities between animals, plants, and inanimate objects. Animals eat, move, and grow. Plants only eat and grow, and inanimate objects do none of these things. He learns how to make more complex tools, and he's able to use the hide of animals for clothes. He builds a small house to live and a small store for his food. He domesticated birds of prey to help him hunt, and chicken to benefit from its eggs and chicks. We can call the next phase the phase of reason. In this phase, Ibn Tufayl gives us a lesson in physics. He says that Hayy started noticing that all material things have dimensions, and he started pondering the heavenly objects in the sky and their motion in orbits. He realizes that all creatures follow a cycle of existence and then death. He wondered about the creation or the eternity of the universe, but then he concludes, regardless of whether the universe was created or eternal, it requires the existence of a mighty eternal creator or sustainer, and he acknowledges the limitation of our senses in realizing this presence. We cannot see him, hear him, touch him, but we realize this presence through the signs all around us in this universe. The next phase, we can call it the phase of wisdom. Hayy not only knows that God exists, but he relates to him with love. The more he realizes the goodness, splendor, and perfection of God, the more he longs for him. It became clear to Hayy that his actions actually have three forms: a beastly way, which imposed on him by his material body; a spiritual way, like the celestial bodies in the sky; and a subjective way derived from God, and this was his highest goal. The last phase is the phase of unity with God. Here, Hayy loses his interests in the things related to our beastly bodies. He only eats what's necessary to maintain his life, taking into account the preservation of spirit, so he stopped killing animals to eat, and when he ate plants, he only ate the plants that are available in abundance. He also emulated the heavenly bodies in their purity. He preserves the environment and maintains the purity of his body and whirls around as they do in the sky. He finally achieves unity with God when he spends long periods of time in solitude and contemplation until one day, and in Ibn Tufayl's own words, he witnesses what no eye has ever seen, no ear has heard, and no human heart has ever imagined. Now, most people think that this could have been a good place to conclude the story of Hayy, but Ibn Tufayl thought otherwise. He now takes us to a different island nearby where we meet new characters. The people in this island follow a true faith, and we meet two friends, Absal and Salaman, who are committed to their faith, but they have two different approaches. Absal searches for spiritual and esoteric meanings and tends to contemplate, interpret, and meditate, while Salaman clings to the literal meaning of the words and adheres to the beliefs of the masses. Absal decides to leave the island and travels to a neighboring one, seeking solitude and meditation. Just by chance, he reaches the island where Hayy lives and spends his days in meditation. One day, the two finally meet, and each one of them was apprehensive about the other. Later, they were assured, and they start trying to communicate. Absal soon realizes that Hayy knows no human languages and proceeds to teach him his own language. After learning Absal's language, Hayy tells him his story, starting from his mother dove, his development, and how he recently achieved unity with God. Absal doesn't find any contradiction between his own religion and what Hayy has achieved. Absal explains to Hayy more about his own religion, its values, and how it expects its followers to worship God. He also tells him about how people in his old island lack fitra and turn away from God's commandments. They then decide to sail to Absal's island, hoping to guide its people to the right path. Hayy proceeds to teach a group of people whom Absal has carefully picked for being intelligent and wise. But after a while, they lose interest and turn away from him. Hayy realizes that the path that he has reached is not suitable for anyone, and that the people of the island have followed a way that suits their abilities and lack of fitra. He apologizes to Salaman and his people, claiming that they are the ones who have found the right path. And then Hayy and Absal bid farewell to everyone and return to their isolated island. And they spend their days in worshipping the necessary existence in their own way, which achieves for them a unity with God. Now let's examine together some of the philosophical ideas discussed in the text. First, let us look at some of the popular philosophical questions at the time of Ibn Tufayl. One of those questions was, what is the nature of knowledge? And how do we learn the information that we acquire and learn? Also, one of the most important philosophical questions was, is the universe eternal or created? And what do the answers of these questions say about the nature of God? Now, let's look at some of the answers that Ibn Tufayl provided in his text. To answer the question of creation or eternal existence of the universe, Ibn Tufayl says, regardless how our universe came to existence, this universe needs and proves the existence of a superior presence. He also examines how humanity would be without tradition or the existence of a human society. And he stresses the value of self-teaching, also called autodidacticism, which was later believed to be the basis of modernity. He also talks about the importance of fitra, or the innate characteristics that we are born with. Ibn Tufayl touches on the importance of preserving the environment where we live. So we can certainly say he was one of the first scholars to try to raise environmental awareness. I'm sure most of us have asked, why does this text have two beginnings? Why can't Ibn Tufayl make up his mind? Well, as we mentioned earlier, one of the important philosophical questions of the time was whether the earth was created or eternal. By telling a story in two different ways, he answers the questions as follows. If the world was created, then it needs a God to create it. And if it's eternal, it needs a God to keep it going eternally. So either way, we will always reach the conclusion that a God exists. So this is Ibn Tufayl's way of reconciling science and philosophy with the scripture. Let's now talk about educational philosophy. Why did Hayy live on a deserted island all by himself? Remember, we said Hayy went through 7 stages in his life that started with frustration and ends with the highest and ultimate goal of any believer, which is a unity with God. Ibn Tufayl thesis is, a child left alone develops into a good and knowledgeable human being. But if we ask him, does this educational philosophy succeed with every child? His answer to us will be no. It requires fitra, which might fade in most societies. It also requires the presence of curiosity, dexterity, purity, and intelligence. The name Hayy Ibn Yaqzan, or Alive Son of Alert, indicates that he was always paying attention and thinking about everything around him. The story of Hayy Ibn Yaqzan also draws our attention to the existence of three types of religious philosophies. The first is the religion of the masses. And this is where the question, how do you know that God exists? Is usually answered by, we know that because He said so in His holy book. The masses are usually dependent on emotions. The second type is the religion of the rationale. And here, the answer to the question, how do we know that God exists? Is by using our own minds. They know God by contemplating and studying His physical signs in the universe. And the last type is the mystic religion. Here, the question, how do we know that God exists, is meaningless to them, because for them, God is manifest. He is a friend or a lover. So what does Ibn Tufayl think about those three religious philosophies? In Hayy Ibn Yaqzan, reason and mystical experiences seem to have formed a symbolic union. Ibn Tufayl does not expect us to repeat Hayy's experience literally. What he wants from us is to achieve independence from social myths, civil coercion, and cultural blindness. Emancipation of our minds and spirit is all Ibn Tufayl asks from us. He sets it as an ideal that those with brave minds seek for themselves. A couple of more philosophical questions discussed in the texts are: what is the essence of mankind? Is mankind basically good? This seems to be Ibn Tufayl's opinion, as he expressed in his book. But other philosophers might have differed, because some think that we are basically like a blank slate that is shaped by society, or we're a blank slate that we shape ourselves, or we are basically evil, as William Golding expressed in his book Lord of the Flies. Let's now see if this book had any influence on thought and civilization. Almost 500 years after the book was written, it got translated into several languages. The first translation was by Edward Pocock. He knew Arabic and traveled to Syria, where he found the text and translated it into Latin. But for some unknown reason, he never published it. Later, his son Edward Jr. found the translation and published it in 1671. A couple of years later, it was translated into English by a Quaker theologian. Later again, it was translated by a Catholic vicar into English from Latin. In 1708, Simon Oakley translated the text from the original Arabic into English, and this was the translation that became popular and widely read. In 1726, the text was translated into German. Now let's look of the influences that this book had on the Age of Enlightenment. The Quaker theologian who translated it found that the book echoed the Quaker doctrine that every human being had an inward light, regardless of faith, gender, or race. Pico, influenced by the text, wrote Oration on the Dignity of Man. Robert Boyle, a natural philosopher, was also influenced by it. Spinoza, the Enlightenment thinker, Leibniz, and John Locke, the father of political liberalism, who used the term tabula rasa that we mentioned before to discuss human nature. Many scholars believe that Daniel Defoe was heavily influenced by the text when he wrote Robinson Crusoe in 1719, a few years after it was translated into English. And until today, we have books and movies like Jungle Book, Tarzan, Jason Bourne series that were all inspired somehow by Hayy Ibn Yaqzan. Did the text spark modernity? This is a big question, and I might be biased if I try to answer it myself. But a professor of history of science in a Tel Aviv University, Evner Ben Zaken, argues that this is very possible. He says, the text argues that in order to get perfect knowledge, the person has to go through a process of only and exclusively first-hand experience and not rely at all on any tradition. This idea is revolutionary for medieval time, and it is radical even for today. We don't have any significant work from any previous philosophical tradition where autodidacticism is presented as a central idea for acquiring knowledge. Accordingly, and this is what he concludes, we can assume that this text and the idea of autodidacticism, which is the essence of modernity, has been one of the essential seeds that influenced the European modernity or Enlightenment. He also adds that maybe the solution of some of the problems of modernity can be fixed by the mixture of rationality and mysticism that Ibn Tufayl suggests. Bin Zakin also hopes that a revival of the text will have profound benefits. First, for Westerners, he says it should inform and remind them of the glorious past of Islam in science and philosophy at the medieval time, and it will make them see how it played a part in shaping their modern culture, thus countering the wave of Islamophobia and hatred. As for Muslims, he hopes it would inspire them to adopt rational thinking along with their religious tradition. This concludes our discussion of the text Hayy Ibn Yaqzan. I hope you've enjoyed it and hope to see you again in future videos.